Hey guys, welcome to tonight's channel where winter stories are woven from breath and firelight in the dark. Tonight, I'll tell you about the Weaver of Winter, a tailor living in the land of eternal snow. One who doesn't just sew clothes for people, but stitches warmth back into the very heart of winter. In his old wooden cabin, where the firelight always flickers, he still sits there, sewing each thread with silver fur, a material no one knows where he finds. Some say he buys it from northern traders. Others swear the wind itself brings it to him. Before we begin, turn down the lights around you, pull your blanket a little higher so the chill outside becomes only a whisper. Relax your shoulders, take a deep breath, because tonight's story will be slow, warm, but carry a touch of frost. If you love journeys like this, don't forget to hit subscribe so I can meet you again on other nights. And hey, where are you listening from? Is it the stillness of midnight? Or an afternoon just turning cold? Tell me so, I'll know who I'm telling this story to in this winter night. The fire in front of you crackles softly, its orange glow reflecting on the snow outside the porch, casting light on the old wooden walls of the small house. Do you hear it? The wind is howling out there, as if it wants to swallow the whole world. But here, in this little room, there's only warmth and a story about to be told. Come a little closer, sit by the hearth, let the firelight fall across your face, and let the wind outside fade into a distant whisper. Tonight, I'll tell you about a man, the one the villagers call by a name whose origin no one remembers. The Weaver of Winter. He isn't a hero, nor a wanderer. Just an old tailor, living in a wooden house at the edge of the village, where snow covers the roof year-round and the smoke from his chimney never stops. They say he weaves the warmest coats in the land, garments that can hold a person's breath even in the fiercest blizzard. But they also say that with every stitch he sews, a breath of his own vanishes into the wind. I don't know if that's true, only that on nights like this, when the storm is coming, when the wind howls through the cracks in the door, everyone hears the faint tinkling of his needle and thread coming from his workshop, steady as a heartbeat. Some say that sound comforts them, as if someone is sewing warmth back into the whole village. Others whisper, it's the sound of a soul bound to its work, never able to rest. Whatever it is, no one dares go near that house after dark. Only the children, curious and brave, stand from afar watching the dim light in his window, imagining the old tailor bent over his loom, back curved, hair silvered with frost, hands trembling but steady. They call it the light of winter, the only one that never goes out at night. And I went there once, long ago, when I was young and thought stories like these were nothing more than the inventions of poor folk trying to decorate their cold lives. I remember that night clearly, the sky white with snow, the ground so deep I sank to my waist with every step. I went out of curiosity, maybe to learn how one could live alone among screaming winds and still keep a fire burning. When I knocked, the sound of sewing stopped. A moment of silence, then the door opened, and light spilled out, golden and soft. He stood there, thin, with a face etched in wrinkles like long threads on old cloth. He said nothing, only nodded and gestured for me to come in. I still remember the smell: fur, dry fabric, wood smoke, and the faint trace of cold wind. His workshop was small: one table, a few spools of thread, and an ancient loom. Yet every strand of cloth on it seemed to breathe, shimmering in the firelight. "Do you work all night?" I asked, just to break the silence. He smiled, voice low and rough, like wind scraping iron. "Winter waits for no one. If I rest, who will sew warmth back for them?" I couldn't tell if he was joking, but the way his eyes looked through me made me fall quiet. Eyes that didn't judge, but measured the cold inside a person's heart. I asked again, "Who do you sew for?" He looked toward the window, where snow lay thick, and said slowly, "For everyone. For those who shiver. For those who are about to forget what warmth feels like. Some pay with coins, some pay with promises." That line has stayed with me ever since. That night, I stayed by the fire, listening to him weave. Each time the needle touched the cloth, a faint note rang out soft, like the sound of a harp string. He said to make a truly warm garment, you must listen to the breath of the snow. Feel the cold not just on your skin, but in your bones. If you sew only to protect the body, the cloth will tear. If you sew to protect the person, the cloth will live, he said, never looking up. I didn't fully understand, but somehow the chill around me began to fade. When I left, he handed me a small piece of fabric thin as mist and told me to keep it. So when the wind comes, you'll remember that someone is still weaving, he said. I took it without thinking much of it. Many years later, in another winter, when the cold felt sharp enough to stop my heart, I remembered that cloth. I took it out, and to my surprise, it was still warm. Warm as if someone's breath was still living inside it. From that night on, I believed. I believed a man like him truly existed. A weaver of winter, living to stitch together the coldest parts of humankind. And tonight, as I sit here by this fire, telling you his story, I'm not trying to prove anything, only to ask, when the cold wind comes knocking on your door, will you sew a coat for yourself or for someone else? Because perhaps that question is the very thread the old tailor left behind, so that we may continue weaving our own winters. That village sat at the edge of the world, where the map ended and the wind began. Winter didn't come and go as it did elsewhere, it stayed, clinging to every rooftop, every tree, every breath. All year long, snow covered everything so completely that no one could tell where the road ended, the river began, or the houses stood. In the morning, the fog hung thick like a grey scarf around one's neck, and at night, the sky held only the pale blue light of the aurora drifting slowly, like an old memory. In that place, people didn't speak much. They simply lived and endured. The wind was the only language everyone understood. It whistled through the cracks in doors, slipped into layers of clothing, into dreams. The wind called the names of the dead and tangled itself in the hair of the living. Amid that still, frozen silence, there was one place where the light never went out. A small house at the far end of the village, tucked against a hill, its chimney smoke rising steady, its lamp glowing until dawn. That was the tailor's workshop. Each night, people saw the orange glow shining through the tiny window, flickering through the curtain of snow. From a distance, you could see a silhouette bent over his work, steady, patient, like an old clock that never stopped ticking. The children of the village would count the flashes of the needle through the window, as if counting the heartbeat of the village itself. The adults would say, "As long as that light's still burning, this winter hasn't killed us yet." They believed that as long as the flame in that house kept burning, the cold outside hadn't yet conquered human warmth. The house was smaller than you'd imagine. The roof sagged, the wood cracked, the walls bore the marks of hammer and chisel, but the windows were always clean so the light could pass through unblocked by ice. Anyone walking by would hear strange sounds inside the soft rasp of fabric, the click of the needle against wood, the slow rhythm of breathing. Some said it was the sound of skillful hands. Others said it was the heartbeat of winter. Whatever it was, no one lingered too long. The air around that house was different, thicker, quieter, as if even the snow held its breath to listen to the sewing within. By day, no one ever saw the tailor step outside. Some said he worked only at night, because only when the wind howled loudest did the thread obey. Others claimed he never slept, having traded his dreams for the gift of weaving warmth. Whatever they believed, everyone agreed on one thing. Without him, the village would have frozen to death long ago. Cloaks, gloves, blankets, fur hats, all passed through his hands. They weren't fancy or decorated, but when you wore one, the cold seemed to stop just beyond the fabric. Some believed that inside every garment was a small prayer, one that kept the wind from touching the wearer's heart. Sometimes traders from the south came, bringing gold and wine, offering to buy his work for 10 times its worth, but they always left empty-handed. The old man never opened his door. They left footprints in the snow, vanished into the storm, and still the light in that house burned unmoving, unfaltering. There was something strange, though he was a tailor. There were no traces of animal hides, no bones, no traps, no hunting knives around his home. No one knew where his materials came from. People only noticed that sometimes, after a night of harsh wind, tufts of silver fur appeared before his door, fine as silk, from no creature anyone could name. Some said they saw him carrying a large sack up the mountain during a blizzard, then returning with threads of light. Others whispered they were gifts from the wind itself, tokens it left in his hands. Whether true or not, no one dared to ask. In this village, people didn't question the things that kept them alive. That winter was harsher than any before. The storms lasted for months, the sun never rose, and snow fell thick enough to bury fences and rooftops. Many fell ill, many fires went out. But the small house at the end of the village, its light still burned. Every night, the fire inside danced, and the loom still sang its needle song. When the wind howled hardest, people heard a faint voice humming old, rough, like a lullaby. No one knew who he was singing to. Maybe to the dead. Maybe to himself, so he wouldn't turn to stone in solitude. A child once asked his mother, "Why doesn't he rest?" The mother only said softly, "If he stops sowing, the wind will know we've grown weak." The child fell silent and never asked again. Years passed, the child grew, but every time the snow swallowed the village, he would still look toward the little light at the end of the hill just to know he was still alive. And me, I tell you this, not to make him into a legend, but so you understand. In this frozen land, warmth doesn't come from fire, but from hands. And in a world made of snow, sometimes one light that never goes out is enough to keep the darkness from swallowing everything. If you listen closely, right now, beneath the sound of the wind outside, you'll hear it, the thin, steady rhythm of a sewing needle. It's not your imagination. It's the sound of the weaver of winter still working, even as the rest of the world sleeps beneath the ice. They say it's been so long that no one remembers his real name. Some claim it was Marin, others swear they once heard someone call him Eldrick, but over the years, the name was carried away by the wind, leaving only the title everyone in the village now used, the Weaver of Wind. It wasn't a name he chose, nor one of honor. It came from a habit of his strange enough to make people half afraid, half reverent. Because while the rest of the village buried themselves under snow to fight the cold, he worked with his window wide open, letting the wind pour in, swirl around his sleeves, and dance through the silver threads running through his needle. People said he wove his garments with the wind itself, that the wind was his true teacher. Each winter, when storms swept through, while everyone locked their doors, sealed their hearths, and buried themselves under blankets, the small house at the edge of the village stayed lit, its window open, the old tailor sitting in silence, head bowed over his work. He didn't speak, didn't hum, didn't sigh. Whenever someone knocked, begging for a coat, he only nodded, motioned for them to sit, and quietly began. His stitches were slow but certain, each needle piercing the fur with its own rhythm. Steady, precise, endlessly patient. When he finished, he folded the coat neatly, set it on the table, never asked for more pay, never even looked at the person receiving it. He simply murmured, "Keep the warmth, don't let it die." People took their coats and left, never daring to ask what he meant. Some said he once worked for the royal court in the south, exiled after crafting a cloak for the king, a cloak that made its wearer never feel cold, but never feel warmth either. Others claimed he had lost someone to a merciless winter, and since then, swore no one else would freeze again. But no one knew the truth. He lived alone, no wife, no children, no friends. His house held only 3 things: a loom, a sewing table, and a small stone hearth. Beneath the floor were spools of thread, wrapped neatly white, silver, and a few strands black as midnight. When asked, he would say only, "Each colour is for a different kind of wind." No one understood, but everyone believed him. Every year, as winter approached, he would vanish for days. People found his footprints leading up the mountain to where the snow never melted. When he returned, he carried a sealed sack. No one knew what was inside. Someone once peeked and swore they saw light, pure silver light, shimmering like threads from the sky. And from that day, they whispered that his coats were not made of fur, but of the breath of snow, something only he could gather in the heart of the storm. He never denied it, but never confirmed it either. For him, silence was the perfect answer. In the village, a few children would sneak up to his window to watch him work. They said his hands trembled, but never missed a stitch. Each time the needle pierced fabric, he tilted his head slightly as if listening to a sound only he could hear. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe it was someone's voice. Once, the blacksmith's boy said, "I saw him cut the fabric not with scissors, but by letting the wind tear it just right." The adults laughed. "Don't make up stories," they said. The wind can't cut cloth. But deep down, none of them were sure. Maybe that's why, when they called him the Weaver of Wind, their voices always dropped with a hint of awe. He lived quietly, but everyone owed him something. A coat that saved a child from freezing, a blanket that helped an elder survive the night, or simply the comfort of knowing that, in this white death, someone was still fighting it for them. Years passed. His hair turned from grey to white, his hands from strong to frail, but his eyes never changed. The eyes of someone who had seen winter too many times to fear it anymore. One year, a group of merchants came from the south, bringing gold and fine velvet. They wanted to hire him, to make coats for nobles, promising him a fortune if he would move to the city. He just looked at them, turned back to his work, and said, "Down there, people buy coats to show off. Up here, people need them to live." The words silenced them. They left, and the wind rose behind them, howling louder, as if applauding him. He never said much, but every word he did stayed in people's minds. Despite the cold, he never turned away anyone who knocked during a storm. Though his hands shook, he never stopped working. Even as the lights in every other house went dark, his stayed bright. So the villagers believed, if this winter lasted longer than any before, if the wind refused to rest, then he must still be there sitting at his loom, stitching together the last remnants of the world's warmth. No one knew how old he was. Some said he'd lived through 3 generations. Others swore he'd arrived only a few years ago. But when the snow melted in that briefest season of thaw, one thing never changed. On the step of his house, there were always 2 footprints pressed deep into the ice. An old pair, facing into the wind, as if he had never left and never would, because perhaps he wasn't just a man. He was the final breath of winter's warmth, the weaver of wind, the one who gave the cold a human heart. When night falls and the wind begins to claw at the windows, that is when he starts to work. The small house is bathed in the pale gold light of an oil lamp, just enough to see his hands moving steadily over the cloth, each stitch sounding like a needle tapping against bone. There is no music, no words, only the sound of thread sliding through fur and the wind blending into a steady rhythm. To an outsider, it looks like he's sewing clothes, but in truth, his work is more like a ritual. Every stitch he makes isn't just joining fabric. It's mending the invisible space between man and the cold, between life and forgetting. There are nights when the temperature drops so low that water freezes solid in the jar, yet in his workshop, sweat still beads on his forehead. Not from the fire, but from a focus so deep it's almost frightening. Each time he pulls the thread, the light catches the silver strands, making it look as if snow is swirling inside the room. He never uses a knife, only his fingernails thick and hardened like horn, worn smooth by years of needles and time. His hands tremble, but never falter. A long scar runs down his thumb, and when the light hits it, it gleams like a sliver of ice. Villagers say he once stitched a coat so tirelessly that the needle pierced his hand, blood soaking into the fabric. But he didn't stop, because if he stopped midway, the coat would die. He believes every garment has its own soul, and that soul must be awakened with absolute precision. Each stitch he sews feels like a letter to winter, sending it a message only he understands. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, the wind howls and the fire dies, but he keeps going. He'll reach out, catch a falling snowflake through the open window, let it melt on the needle, and then continue. Fresh snow is softer than water. Only it listens, he once told his only apprentice, when she asked why he didn't keep the room warm. She saw his hands pale and blue, veins raised like frozen cords, but there was no fatigue in his eyes. Perhaps the cold was what kept him alive. Outside, the wind blew so hard that other houses had to wedge their doors shut with stones, but in his workshop there was a small crack, just enough for the wind to slip through. It brushed past the threads hanging from the ceiling beams, making them hum in delicate notes. He listened. Whenever one thread sang the right tone, he chose it to use. The apprentice said it was coincidence, but he only replied, "No, the wind chooses me. I don't choose the wind." She laughed, but in the firelight she saw clearly the wind truly danced around him, stirring his hair but never snuffing the flame. As if there was an invisible pact between 2 old beings, man and nature. The wooden loom before him was so old it groaned with every press, but he refused to replace it, saying, "New frames don't know the rhythm of the wind yet." Its creaks joined the needle's taps and the wind's whisper, forming a wordless symphony. His hands worked in silence, but his eyes never stilled. He looked at the fabric as if it were alive. After every few stitches he paused, as if asking the cloth for permission to continue. When he felt it agree, only then did he sew again. Villagers who had once snuck up to watch from the doorway all told the same story. When he worked, the air inside his house felt different, cold but easy to breathe. Some who were ill claimed they recovered just by sitting near his door. No one could explain it. They only knew that the warmth from his home wasn't like fire, it was like breath. Gentle, real, and lasting. Sometimes he worked so long he forgot the passage of time. There were nights when the snow piled high enough to crush the roof, yet he never stopped. He only stopped when the first wild rooster crowed from the hillside, and the white morning light streamed through the window, shining on the finished coat. He would place a hand on it and close his eyes, saying nothing. Once, his apprentice asked, "Why do you pray over every coat?" He opened his eyes, looked at her, his voice rough. "Because when someone wears it, a part of my breath goes with them. I must know who I'm giving it to." She fell silent and never asked again. After that, she stopped calling him a tailor. She called him what the rest of the village whispered, the weaver of wind. In the nights that followed, she noticed every time he finished a coat, the wind outside softened, as if even winter bowed its head before his precision. Some joked that if he ever stopped sewing, the snow would cease to fall, but no one dared to test it, because if that were true, silence would be far more terrifying than cold. He didn't sew to live, he sewed to keep others alive. Each stitch he made was a breath sent out into the frozen world, a thread connecting his hands to the heartbeat of life beyond the walls. And perhaps that's why the wind loved him. It didn't shatter his windows or snuff out his flame, it just stayed outside, singing softly. And within that song was a rhythm, the rhythm of needle meeting thread, the rhythm of the old man's heart, the rhythm of winter itself being sewn back together, stitch by stitch, until dawn. No one in the village ever truly knew where he got his materials. The coats he made were always light, soft, but when touched, people could feel a strange warmth, not the kind born of fire, but one that spread slowly from within, gentle and calm like an embrace. A child once said that when wearing his coat, they could hear the wind sleeping. The adults only laughed, but anyone who had worn his work knew there was something truly different in every strand of fur. One night, while the snowstorm still raged, someone saw him leave the village carrying a large cloth sack, walking northward. No one ever went that way, because that was the white region where the ground and sky became one, and every sound was swallowed by snow. People said if you went too far, you would reach the land of the snow wolves, mythical creatures that lived only where the cold was so deep it could freeze blood in the veins. They were massive, with silver fur that shimmered like moonlight, eyes blue as shattered ice, and whenever they ran, the wind itself seemed to bow beneath their feet. No one dared go near them, for they were not just predators, they were the spirits of winter, the embodiment of the wild wind. Yet he went, carrying only a wooden staff, an old knife, and a thin, silver cord that gleamed like frozen light. He told no one, only locked his workshop door and left a small lamp burning on the table, a promise that he would return. 3 days, 4 nights, no one saw him. Then, on the 5th night, when the storm calmed, the villagers heard a wolf's howl echoing from the distant woods, long, low, mournful, and then silence. The next morning, he returned. On his shoulder was a silver sack, soaked in snow, so heavy that each of his steps left deep marks in the ground. His eyes were different that day, something faintly burning within them, but cold enough to chill the soul. He told no one what had happened. He only went into his workshop and shut the door. Days later, smoke rose from the chimney again, and the light shone once more. When someone came by with torn clothes to mend, they saw on his table strands of long silver fur, soft, fine, each one reflecting light like threads of the night sky. He touched them gently and said, "The fur of the snow wolves doesn't warm the body, it warms the heart." When asked how that was possible, he only smiled and replied, "When you're cold enough that your heart forgets how to beat, this reminds it." From then on, the coats he made held strange power. Those who wore them in blizzards did not shiver. Some who were near death found their wounds stilled and their breath evened once wrapped in one. The villagers called them the coats of living wind, but he never claimed the credit. Whenever people thanked him, he would say, "Don't thank me. Thank the wolves who allowed me their breath." Those words sent chills down many spines. Some swore they had seen wolf tracks around his house, as if they guarded it from the storm. Others claimed that on certain nights they heard howls close by, and through the snow they saw silver glimmers circling his home, not fire, but wolf fur dancing on the wind. He always chose strange times to gather his materials, not when the skies were calm, but during the fiercest storms. "Only in raging winds does the silver fur fall," he said, "for wolves shed only when winter truly awakens in fury." His apprentice once asked if he killed them. He shook his head, his sunken eyes gleaming with quiet sorrow. "No, I only take what they leave behind. Each strand of fur is an old breath. I only reconnect it." She fell silent, for in his words was the reverence of one who knows he is small before nature. From then on, she no longer saw him as a tailor, but as a man who kept a vow with winter itself. Once, she followed him secretly into the forest. Under a dim moon, they passed through pale trees to a place where the wind had no sound. There, in the endless white, lay a pack of wolves, massive, majestic, silent. They did not attack. When he stepped forward, they stepped back, leaving a space where patches of silver fur lay scattered in the snow. He bent down, picking each strand with care, as if touching something sacred. The largest wolf approached, staring straight into his eyes. Their gaze met still as stone, then it turned away. The girl trembled behind him, but he only whispered, "They know I'll return this, once I've woven the coat for the wind." After that night, she never followed him again. But whenever she saw him sitting at the table, holding a silver thread, she could see the image of the wolves reflected in his eyes. From then on, he took no more apprentices. She understood there are things that cannot be taught with words. They must be woven with blood, with time, and with silence. That year, winter came earlier, colder, harsher, yet strangely, no one in the village froze. Everyone had new coats, thick, light, warm, and when storms rose, people heard the wind blowing through the fabric. It didn't howl, it didn't scream, it breathed. The elders said it was the wolves singing. The children said it was the sound of hearts. And he, sitting quietly beside his loom, eyes distant, fingers brushing over the silver threads, whispered softly, "No breath is ever lost. It only changes form to keep the world warm." Every year, when the first winds of the season began to change direction, when the white crows flew back toward the mountains, people knew the weaver of the wind was about to set out. No one asked, and no one saw him off. They simply watched his figure fade into the curtain of snow. It had become an unspoken ritual, as if he and winter had a private pact, one only the two of them could understand. He walked into the frozen forest, where snow never ceased to fall, and the light lay buried beneath a thick white layer like a forgotten memory. No one dared follow that path, for it led to a place even maps refused to record. People called it the Silent Field, because there, the wind did not roar, it breathed. The snow did not fall, it drifted like smoke. Those who had ever wandered into it said that the deeper you went, the slower time became. Sound disappeared, and even the human heart seemed to beat softer, afraid of waking something sleeping beneath the ice. Yet every year, he went quietly, as if it were simply part of the rhythm of winter itself. He carried a large cloth sack, his old knife, a worn wooden staff, and the thick silver cloak he had woven himself. Before leaving, he would stand at his doorway, eyes sweeping once over the village. His gaze wasn't sad, nor hesitant, only as if measuring how much warmth remained here, deciding whether it was enough for him to go. Then he would turn away, saying nothing. His apprentice once asked, "What are you searching for?" He only replied, "Not searching meeting." The answer silenced her, because in his voice was something distant yet near, as if his journey wasn't to find anything but to keep a promise. On the road, snow rose to his knees, and the cold split his skin like cracked earth. He walked slowly, but steady. Each step left a faint mark, only to be erased by the wind moments later as if he had never passed. By day, the light was dim and colourless. There was no boundary between morning and dusk, only a pale ivory glow. At night, he stopped and lit a fire, struck from stone, no wood, only threads soaked in oil and his own breath. The flame burned softly, blue and low, carving sharp, deep lines across his face. He sat there and listened to the wind. Sometimes it hissed past his ears like a voice calling his name. Sometimes it whispered beside him, "You've come again, haven't you?" He didn't answer. He only closed his eyes and placed his hand on the ground, feeling the cold seep through his flesh. "I do not come to take," he murmured. "I come to remember." At dawn, he walked again. Once, when the snow thinned, he saw wolf tracks deep, clear, leading toward the cliffs. He followed them, through trees frozen solid like statues. When he reached an icy valley where the wind blew as if from the belly of the earth, he stopped. Before him stood a pack of snow wolves. They did not snarl, nor flee, only watched him. Their eyes were pale blue, still as the sky before a storm. He knelt down silently, untied his sack, and revealed a thin silver cord. The wind swept through, stretching the sound like a song sung by the mother of storms. He raised his hand, brushing the air gently as though stroking an invisible wolf. Then, softly, one of them stepped forward and bowed its head. With great care, he cut a small tuft of silver fur from its shoulder, tying it together without letting a single strand fall. No blood came. The wolf only looked at him, as if granting permission. When he stepped back, it howled a long, echoing cry that rolled through the valley, carrying the wind and the snow with it. He bowed his head in return. Then the pack dissolved into the white, fading like breath into winter itself. He stayed there until the last light vanished, then turned back home. Each year he repeated this journey. Each time he returned, he looked older, but his eyes shone brighter, as if carrying a light no one else could see. His apprentice asked him once more, "Aren't you afraid?" He answered, "I was. But when I saw the wind mend its own wounds, I understood fear is part of warmth." After that, he fell silent. When he came back to the village, he never spoke of what had happened. He only opened his sack, took out tufts of silver fur, dried them with the warmth of his palms, and laid them on the loom. Some curious souls tried to peek inside, but the moment they stepped through the door, the cold pressed against their chests so sharply they had to back away. That room was no longer a workshop, it was a shelter for the wind itself. Days later, silver light began to seep through the window, faint as mist, and people knew he had started sewing coats from the new snow wolf fur. The villagers whispered to one another that the wind had softened that year, and the snow no longer bit the skin. Perhaps because in every strand he brought back, there was a fragment of the wolves, those creatures who had lived alongside the wind. Perhaps he carried something else too, something unseen, but deeply felt, the stillness of one who had touched the border between cold and life. When storms rose, the elders would say, "Don't fear, he has gone and returned. The wind knows his face, the snow respects his hands." And the children, whenever they saw the light glowing in his workshop, would whisper, "He's sowing the wolf's breath into our coats." And so, that winter, no matter how fierce the storms, no one froze to death. They lived, never realizing that within every coat they wore beat the hearts of the wolves and the loneliness of the man who dared walk into the white to bring them back. Rumors about him began to spread through the village like smoke slipping under rooftops, thin, hazy, and too real to dismiss. People didn't dare speak loudly, only whispered beside the fire, on nights when the wind howled so long that even the crack of burning wood sounded like cries. Some said he didn't hunt wolves or kill any at all. He only searched for those that had died in the storms, taking their fur afterward. They claimed he went to where the wind was fiercest, where wolves lay still beneath the snow like statues made of ice, and he would kneel, not crying, not afraid, just touch them gently, as if asking permission. People said that when he bowed his head, the wind stopped, and when he lifted his hand, the silver fur would drift up, floating in the air before gathering into bundles inside his sack. He didn't take it with his hands, but with his breath. "Wind fur only listens to those who can speak its language," he once told a child brave enough to ask. The child later said that when he spoke, the air grew colder, but his voice was warm, so warm. The adults laughed when they heard the story, but shivered too. Because in this land, there was one old taboo. No one must speak to the wind. They believed the wind carried the souls of the dead, and anyone who listened to it would slowly lose their own. But if that were true, how had he survived so many winters, strong as ever? Some argued, no, he doesn't listen to the wind, he's just used to it. Yet even they didn't believe themselves. Because sometimes, when the wind swept over rooftops, they heard something syllables, slow and steady being spoken, as if someone were reading to the snow itself. Not the sound of wind, but the rhythm of a working hand, of a needle gliding through cloth, of a man whispering to the storm. An old hunter in the village once said he'd seen something. When he was young, he followed the tailor's footprints, curious to know what the man did in the woods. As night fell and the blizzard rose, he hid behind a boulder and saw the weaver of the wind standing in the middle of a white valley, surrounded by wolves covered in snow. He didn't use a knife, didn't touch them. He just raised a long needle into the air, piercing the silence itself. Then, strand by strand, the silver fur lifted from their bodies, twisting around him, drawn by some invisible rhythm. When the wind went still, the wolves turned to dust, and he walked away slowly as if he'd just sent them off to somewhere beyond winter. The old hunter said that when he saw it, he no longer felt the cold, only fear. Fear, because he realized that man no longer belonged entirely to this world. But he also said, if he takes fur from the dead, then why have the mountain wolves never attacked the village? No one could answer. In fact, the real wolves in the forest avoided his home. On storm nights, when people locked their doors and the wolves howled madly in the distance, there was only silence around his house. Some said the wolves stood guard not out of fear, but respect. A widow once swore that when her son got lost in a blizzard, it was the wolves' howls that led the search party to him. When they found the boy, he was lying by a frozen stream, wrapped in a silver cloth the woman recognized as the tailor's work. Yet she had never asked him to sew it. When she confronted him, he only said, "They brought it to me." After that, no one dared speak ill of him again. But the rumors lived on, like another spirit drifting between rooftops. Some claimed he didn't live on food or water, but on wind. Every night, he opened his window, letting the gusts sweep through, and by morning, the lamp inside his home still burned, though the oil in the jar never went down. Another child said they once saw him standing outside in the snow, eyes closed, hand outstretched, letting the wind slide between his fingers and smiling. He was talking to someone, the child said, but there was no one there. The adults told the child it was just a dream, but deep down, they knew perhaps he really was listening to something they could not hear. Some believed the wind told him the names of those who had died in storms, so he could stitch their memories into coats for the living. That was why his garments didn't just keep out the cold, they held the souls of the lost. Maybe that was why, when people wore them, they felt calm, as if someone they loved was standing behind them, shielding them from the storm. Others said he was a sorcerer, that every thread he used held a drop of his own blood, that he traded his years for miracles. But if that were true, why had he never fallen ill? Why could he walk through snow without leaving footprints? The questions drifted through the years, carried by the storms, fading into silence. Only one thing was certain. Every year he left, and every year the village survived. So even if they feared him, even if they doubted, they always looked toward the little house whose golden light never went out. Because they knew rumors are like the wind. They pass and disappear. But he does not. He is the one who makes the wind bow its head and reminds the snow that it was once as soft as a human breath. She came on a morning when the sky was so white that you couldn't tell where the snow ended and the mist began. The path to his house was eerily silent. The only sound was her boots sinking into the ice, dry, hollow, as if each step was pressing into the cold of her own breath. When she knocked, no one answered. The wind slipped through the cracks in the wood, making the sound echo back like it came from deep underground. She was about to leave when the door opened without a sound, just a faint golden glow spilling out from the lamp inside. He stood there thin, slightly bent, his eyes deep as frozen wells. He didn't ask who she was or why she came. He only looked down at her hands, clenched inside wool gloves. Then he turned his back and said quietly, "If you wish to learn, stay silent." So she stepped in, leaving behind the familiar world, and entered a place where the air smelled of dry fabric, melting snow, and time that had stopped moving. There was no fireplace in the house, only a loom, a wooden table, and countless spools of silver thread hanging from the ceiling. She shivered, not from the cold, but from the feeling that thousands of eyes were watching her. The shimmering threads seemed alive, trembling faintly when the wind passed through. He sat down, lifted a long needle, and motioned her closer. She watched every movement with quiet awe. He didn't use fire to soften the strands, nor steam to press the cloth. He only breathed. A slow, steady breath, mist curling from his lips, touching the silver threads until they softened, bending to the needle's path. "How can you do that?" she blurted out. He didn't answer right away. "Still sewing, each stitch deliberate," he said softly. "Because I don't use strength. I use life." She didn't understand, but she didn't dare ask more. In the days that followed, she watched. He worked endlessly day and night, steady as a clock wound by the wind. He never lit a fire, yet warmth always surrounded him. She noticed that every time he exhaled, the thread before him glowed faintly, and the snow drifting through the open window melted when it touched his hands. She tried to imitate him, but her threads always snapped cold and lifeless. He simply said, "You're sewing with your hands, not your heart." The words silenced her. At night, when he rested, she stayed by the loom. Moonlight slipped through the window, making the threads gleam like faint smoke. She took a deep breath and exhaled onto the strand. This time, it didn't break, but it didn't soften either. It quivered once, then went still. She thought she heard laughter, light, airy, brushing the back of her neck. She turned, but no one was there. Only him, standing by the doorway, his gaze calm, not angry, still as a frozen lake. "The wind doesn't like those who rush," he said. "To weave for winter, you must learn to be silent like snow, yet live like fire." She bowed her head. From that day, she stopped asking questions. Time passed, and she grew used to the silence. She noticed that in the workshop, the wind never howled. Even with the door open, even when snow swept in, the air inside remained still. Only the sound of the needle and their breathing filled the room. He taught her to feel the cloth with her fingertips, without looking. "Each thread has its own rhythm," he said. "If you force it to move against itself, the cloth will stiffen and warmth will leave it." She practiced, and soon she discovered something strange. When she focused, she could truly hear a sound faint, steady, like a heartbeat coming from the silver strands. Slow and even, it blended with her breathing, creating a melody no instrument could ever play. Each night, she slept near the work table, and often woke halfway through the night, hearing him talking not to her, but to someone in the wind. His voice was low, gentle, sometimes like a lullaby, sometimes like conversation. She didn't understand the language, but listening to it made her calm, as if the winter itself had grown kind. Once, she dared to ask, "Who are you talking to?" He replied without looking up, "To the one who helps me keep the world warm." She said nothing, but inside her bloomed a quiet, relentless curiosity. She wondered who that one was, the spirit of the wolves, the wind, or a part of himself. One night she saw him leave the house, walking into the storm, carrying nothing but his silver needle. She wanted to follow, but the snow was too deep. By morning, he returned, a sack of shining fur over his shoulder. He only said, "The wind has given enough." She didn't know what given meant, but in his eyes was a gentle light, like a flame that could never die. In the months that followed, she began to make coats. Hers weren't as warm as his, but those who wore them said it felt like being embraced. He didn't praise her, only rested a hand on her shoulder and said, "You can hear the voice of the thread now. But remember, don't forget you're still human. When you weave with your heart, make sure it still beats." She didn't understand the meaning until years later, after he was gone. But in that moment, inside the silent house, surrounded by the breath of snow, she knew she wasn't just learning to sew clothes. She was learning how to listen to life within death, how to hold warmth in the coldest place on earth with her own breath. In the days that followed, the workshop sank into a strange kind of silence. Not the emptiness of loneliness, but a thick stillness, like fog wrapping around two people learning to understand each other through breath alone. She no longer asked questions. She only watched, only listened. The steady sound of the needle became the heartbeat of the house, and every time the wind passed through the window frame, the threads hanging from the ceiling trembled, ringing softly like distant bells. He taught her how to listen not with her ears, but with her skin, her heart, and the rhythm between silences. The sound of fabric doesn't come from where the needle touches, he said. It comes from the breath of the one who sews it. He placed a piece of silver fur in her hand and told her to close her eyes. Now tell me, is it cold or warm? She clenched it tight. At first, it was freezing like touching ice. But after a few breaths, she felt it grow warmer, softer, almost pulsing. See? He murmured. Even the cold breathes. People just forgot how to hear it. She opened her eyes and found him watching her not with the dryness of a teacher, but with the patience of someone who had lived too long in silence, waiting for another to listen beside him. Each day, he gave her small tasks, brushing fur, smoothing thread, testing the fabric stretch. But what he truly taught her wasn't craft. He taught her to tell the difference between kinds of cold. There's cold that touches the skin and leaves, he said, and cold that goes straight to the heart. He placed different rolls of cloth in her hands, told her to breathe deep, and describe which kind it was. At first, they all felt the same cold, damp, making her shiver. But slowly, she began to notice the tiny differences. Some cold was sharp, like a blade, like wind on the mountaintop. Some cold was soft like water, creeping and persistent. And some cold was still the kind that didn't make her tremble, but slowed her heartbeat. That, he said, is the cold of true winter. It doesn't kill. It holds like a mother's hand keeping her child asleep. She didn't know why she believed him, but from that moment, she knew she was learning more than a craft. She was learning to speak with a world humanity had stopped listening to. Sometimes, when she was tired, he told her to stop and listen to the snow. She thought it was a metaphor until one day he opened the window wide, letting the cold flood in, thick and white. Listen, he said. Listen to the snow falling. She closed her eyes. At first, only the wind. But then, beneath it, something real small, steady sounds, like breathing. Each snowflake made its own sound as it landed, its own rhythm. And when thousands fell together, they became a nearly invisible song. See? He said. They're not silent like we think. They just speak differently. From then on, she understood him better. In the mornings, when pale light touched the loom, they said nothing only worked in perfect stillness. When she stitched wrong, he didn't scold. He only looked at her, then touched the thread gently so she could hear the faint snap. The thread is angry, he said. It doesn't want to go that way. Under his hands, the thread softened again, obedient, almost comforted. She began to sense the rhythm of each strand, as if every piece of cloth had a soul waiting to be called by name. Once, she asked, "Do you ever get tired of listening so much?" He replied, "No, I only get tired when others stop listening." The words stayed with her, both a curse and a promise. Slowly, a language without words formed between them. When he set a spool of thread on the table, she knew it meant begin. When he handed her the needle, it meant a new lesson. And when he went quiet, staring out the window, she knew he was listening to winter. On nights when storms came and the village went dark, their little house stayed lit. They sat across from each other, surrounded by rolls of silver cloth, reflecting the lamp's glow like broken moons. She sewed, he wove. With every stitch she made, the wind outside answered not with a howl but with agreement. She came to understand. He didn't fight the wind, he moved with it. The wind was his friend, his partner, his unseen teacher. And through him she learned to hear something she had never known before, the sound of her own breathing. A true weaver, he said, isn't one who can make clothes, but one who can listen until their breath becomes one with the breath of the world. She looked at him, and in the lamplight, his eyes reflected like melting ice. In that moment, she understood he was no longer just a man. He was the part of the wind that chose to stay in human form to teach others how to survive without losing silence. And in that room, between them, between the trembling threads that pulsed like heartbeats, there was a rare harmony, one that needed no words, no fire, only breath and stillness. A stillness that could sing, could weave, could hold the fragile warmth that remained in the endless winter. One night, while she was putting away the rolls of fabric, she discovered something strange. In his basket of threads, besides the familiar white, grey and black ones, there was a small spool wrapped separately in a piece of silver silk, locked inside a wooden box. The light it gave off wasn't metallic, it was soft, like breath frozen in the cold air. She stared, mesmerized, until she forgot even the sound of the wind howling outside. He entered, saw her looking, and said nothing. He simply closed the box gently and laid his hand upon it. "This," he said quietly, "is not meant for fabric." Curiosity filled her. "Then what is it for?" she asked. He was silent for a long time, eyes reflecting the flame from the oil lamp. "Every coat I make has one strand of it," he finally said. "Just one, no more." She frowned. "Why only one?" He smiled a rare, tired smile. "One is enough, because it's the thread that connects a person to warmth." She didn't understand. "Connects how?" He touched his chest. "Through a promise," he said. His voice was low, slow, and in the flickering light his face seemed carved by time, not from age but from memory. He took out a short piece of the silver thread and handed it to her. "Touch it," he said. She reached out and flinched. It wasn't cold, it wasn't hot. It was warm, a strange, living warmth, like holding someone's hand. "Feel that?" he asked. "It has a human breath in it, because it was woven from the last breath of someone who promised to return." She froze. "A promise?" He nodded. "Long ago, someone went into the storm with me. We promised that if one of us didn't return, the other would keep their last breath and weave it into thread, so neither of us would forget what warmth feels like." He paused, eyes down, hand trembling slightly. "I kept my promise. They never came back." She said nothing. The room fell into silence, broken only by the murmur of the wind outside. She saw his hand shaking not from cold, but from something deeper. In the lamplight, he looked like part of the winter itself, quiet, lonely, yet carrying warmth beneath the ice. "Since that day," he went on softly, "I've stopped sewing with fur alone. I stitch warmth with memory, with unfinished promises. Every coat I make carries one of these threads, not to hold heat, but to remind the wearer that someone once believed in their breath." He looked at her. "Do you understand, girl? People don't die from the cold. They die when they forget they were once warm." She bit her lip, unable to speak. He rose, walked to the loom, and sat down. From a half-finished coat, she saw it a single, silver line running through the white threads, so thin it was nearly hidden. Yet when she looked closely, it trembled, faintly alive. He guided the needle, sewing each stitch through it. "Every time I place this thread," he said, "the wind stops blowing. As if it's listening, remembering its own promise." She sat beside him, watching his hands move. The silver light from the thread filled the room, soft and deep, not cold at all. "And if the one wearing this coat keeps their breath for another," he continued, "the thread will never fade. It will live on, linking one person to the next, one strand but unbroken." He took her hand and placed it on the fabric. "Feel it." She did, and felt a heartbeat. Slow, steady, neither strong nor weak, the same rhythm as his own. "You see," he said, "my breath, their promise, and now your hand. We're weaving together." She couldn't speak, her eyes burned. "Then, when you're gone," she whispered, "who will continue the weaving?" He smiled. "Whoever knows how to listen." His words were as light as breath, yet they lingered in her all night. After that, she began to notice something new. Every time he finished a coat, the wind outside truly paused. Once, she opened the door and stepped out. The snow was falling, but slower, as if held by invisible hands. When she turned back, he had fallen asleep at the table, head resting beside the glowing silver thread. She understood, then his stitches didn't just mend fabric. They mended the world piece by piece, breath by breath, promise by promise. And within each coat lay a part of his soul, woven so finely no eye could see. In later years, she kept a single piece of that thread thinner than hair, brighter than frost, wrapped around her wrist as a reminder. Whenever she touched it, She felt warmth spread through her skin, not the warmth of flesh, but of memory. The memory of a man who promised to weave warmth into winter, until the wind itself ceased to blow. That winter came early and fierce, as if the sky had grown tired of being gentle for too long. The wind no longer blew, it screamed. The snow no longer fell, it hurled itself down like thousands of white blades. The entire north was buried beneath a colossal blanket of ice, so cold that even sound could shatter in the air. People called it the silent winter, because no one dared to speak more than a few words, afraid their breath would freeze mid-sentence and die between their lips. When the southern villages began to freeze over, fear spread like wildfire. They heard rumours of a man far to the north, one who could weave coats that warmed not just the body but the heart. Coats made from the breath of wind and the promises of souls. And so, one by one, they left their homes, families, possessions, hopes, and began their desperate journey north, toward the place called the Village of the Wind Weaver. They arrived through storms, faces pale, lips cracked, collapsing before the small house whose light still burned through the blizzard. Hundreds of them crowded at the door, pleading, begging, weeping. "Please, make me a coat, just one. I'll pay any price. For my child, she's dying of the cold. I have gold, silver, jewels, take them. Just make us something." But the old man sat still at his table, needle in hand, lamplight flickering beside him. He did not look up, he did not answer. Only his apprentice stepped out, trembling before the crowd. "Please," she said, "wait. He can't make coats for everyone, but panic makes beasts of people." A man surged forward, slamming his hands against the door. "You're no saint. If you can make coats to save lives, why won't you? Or are you keeping them for yourself?" Another shouted, "Open the door. Don't leave us to die out here." They pounded harder, the sound of wood cracking blending with the storm, a symphony of despair. Through the dim light, the girl saw the old man still sitting, eyes closed, one hand resting on the half-sewn coat before him. The silver thread trembled as if on the verge of breaking. She knew he was listening not to them, but to the wind. Outside, the storm grew worse. Then suddenly, a howl, long, low, rising from the depths of the forest. Wolves. The sound froze the crowd. The wind stopped. The snow paused mid-air. Someone whispered, trembling, "Snow wolves. They only howl when someone is about to die." A child cried out. The apprentice stood at the door and shouted, "Go! Please, don't make the wind angry." But no one listened. Then the old man opened his eyes. His gaze cut through the blizzard, quiet, but powerful enough to still the air itself. He rose, walked to the door, and opened it. The wind rushed in, scattering the light, sending thousands of snowflakes swirling through the air like tiny spirits. The crowd recoiled. They thought he would drive them away. But instead, he stepped outside into the storm, silver needle in hand, his cloak whipping in the wind. He moved among them slowly, fearlessly. "You came here seeking warmth," he said, his voice not loud, yet carried by the wind itself. "But warmth isn't something I can sew for everyone. Each of you must keep your own." A woman wept. "But we have nothing left." His eyes softened. "I know. I once lost everything too. But if you no longer believe in your own breath, my coats will mean nothing." He reached into his sleeve and drew out a small spool of silver thread, glimmering faintly. He cut pieces from it, one by one, and handed them to those nearest. "Hold it in your hand," he said. "Then breathe. If it glows, you will live. If it doesn't, you still have a chance, but you must kindle it yourself." The crowd hesitated. One man obeyed. He cut the thread, closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and miraculously, it shimmered a soft firefly light amid the snowstorm. Others followed, one by one. Their breaths rose in clouds of mist, wrapping around the silver threads like ghostly silk, until hundreds of tiny lights floated in the air, glowing softly. The apprentice watched, tears welling. She understood now he wasn't sewing coats for them. He was teaching them to weave their own warmth. But not everyone succeeded. Some tried, again and again, and their threads stayed dark, rigid as ice. They fell to their knees, crying for help. The old man went to them, resting a hand on each trembling shoulder. "The wind does not hear those who have forgotten their promises," he whispered. "But if you can remember anything that once made you feel warm, it will return. Some thought of mothers, some of their children, some of lovers long lost, and then a spark, faint but real, enough to light the wind." The storm eased. The howls faded into the distance. Only the sound of breathing remained, and the drifting glow of 100 tiny lights. By morning, the blizzard had passed. The survivors left the village, each carrying a thread wrapped around their hands or hearts. None of them ever forgot that night. As for him, he went back into his workshop and closed the door. The apprentice asked, "What did you do out there?" He replied, "I didn't give them coats. I gave them back a promise." "A promise from whom?" she asked. He smiled, gazing out the window where the snow began to fall again. "From the wind, it promised that as long as I keep sowing, it will keep blowing. And today, it kept its word." Rumours about the coats of the wind weaver spread farther than ever before, beyond the borders of snow and stone, reaching even the southern cities where people had never known true cold. There, wealthy merchants, men warmed by gold and greed, began to whisper about a kind of cloth that could warm the soul itself. They didn't believe in legends, but they believed in value. Gold could buy anything that was what they believed. And so, when the storms ended and the northern roads opened again, they set out. 3 great sleds, horses wrapped in white fur, dozens of servants, chests of silver and boxes of jewels. They arrived in the village during a soft snowfall, when the light inside his workshop still burned. The apprentice was the first to see them, their fine silk coats, soft leather gloves, and steps too careful, as if afraid to stain themselves with snow. They didn't look like people of the frost, but like those who came from lands where the sun never dies. The leader, an older merchant, wore a black wolf fur hat and had eyes sharp as knives. He stepped forward, knocked 3 times on the wooden door, each thud echoing like an omen. The old tailor opened the door. He didn't look surprised, as if he had been expecting them. The merchant bowed politely, his voice roughened by the cold but still carrying the confidence of wealth. "We come from the southern capital. We've heard you make coats that can keep a man warm through the fiercest storm. We wish to buy them all." The tailor looked at them, then at the large sack they set down, overflowing with gold, silver, and gems. He said nothing. The merchant continued, "You could rest for the rest of your life. We'll take your name across the world. Everyone will know the wind weaver. Your coats will be worn by nobles at banquets, by kings themselves." The apprentice stood nearby, shivering not from the cold, but from the warmth in his voice, the false warmth of someone who had never truly been frozen. The tailor still didn't answer. He only looked out the window, where snow was falling softly, quietly, like a breath. After a long silence he asked, "If I sell all my coats to you, who will keep the villagers warm?" The merchant smirked. "You can make more. We'll bring workers, tools, you'll teach us the weaving, and we'll produce them in numbers. The cold isn't just here, it's everywhere. And the rich will pay any price to escape it." The old man set his needle down slowly. "You want to fight the cold with gold?" His voice was calm, not angry, just heavy with sorrow. "You don't understand. The cold isn't out there, it's in the heart." The merchant frowned, his tone sharpening. "We came to buy, not to listen to riddles." He stepped closer, eyes glinting. "You could save lives by selling. Or do you prefer to let people die in the snow just to keep your reputation?" The apprentice stepped forward and said softly, "He's not keeping his reputation. He's keeping his promise." The merchant turned, a faint sneer curling on his lips. "Promises don't feed the living." The old man replied quietly, "No, but they keep them alive." In the small room, no one spoke after that. Only the wind filled the silence, steady, cold, distant. The merchant gestured. His servants opened the chest. Gold spilled out, light flooding the wooden walls, turning the room into a chamber of shimmering warmth. "Look," he said, "this light burns brighter than your lamp." The tailor looked down, then gently blew on the lamp. The flame wavered, then steadied. "No," he said, "your light only shines when someone's watching. Mine burns even when I'm alone." The words silenced the entire company. The tailor rose, walked to the door, and opened it. The wind swept in, carrying a shimmer of silver mist. "The coats I make aren't meant for ballrooms," he said. "They're for those who shiver, for those who have forgotten what warmth feels like. If you wear them only to display them, they will die." He turned, his gaze like frost, like wind, like time itself. "The coat isn't for those who fear the cold. It's for those who know it." Then he closed the door. Gold fell to the floor, ringing hollow in the stillness. The apprentice bent to gather it, but he placed a hand on her shoulder and shook his head. "Leave it," he said. "The wind will know what to do with it." And strangely, that night, a storm rose. By morning, the gold was gone, only a faint silver trail remained, stretching from his door into the forest. The villagers said the wind had returned the gold to the earth. The merchants left in silence, never looking back. Some swore that night, they saw the old tailor standing in the snow, his hand raised and every coin turning into dust, scattering into the wind. From then on, no one dared come to buy his coats again. People stopped calling him the tailor and began calling him the keeper of warmth, because he didn't sell what he made. He gave it only to those who truly needed it. And the apprentice, for the first time, understood why every coat had a single silver thread, because it wasn't a bond between man and fabric, but between soul and heart, between the cold and the thing that makes us human. The next morning, when the snow fell thin like a veil, the southern merchant returned. No more offers, no more arrogant glances, only the tense expression of a man too used to being obeyed. He brought fewer people this time, just a handful of servants, and wore a coat so thick that the man beneath it was almost unrecognizable. He bowed, his voice less proud but still edged with the cold calculation of a negotiator. "We've travelled many days through the storm to come back," he said. "Not to buy them all, only one. One coat for the leader of the South, who lies sick from the frost. If you make it, we will never forget your kindness." The old tailor didn't reply. He sat by the loom, his hands stitching slowly, each movement steady as breath. The dim light of the lamp reflected on the silver thread at the tip of his needle, forming a fragile halo. The apprentice stood beside him, barely daring to breathe. The air between them was frozen still. After a long silence, he finally spoke, his voice quiet but clear. "My coats are not for those in power." The merchant looked up, anger flashing in his eyes. "Why not? Do you think kings don't feel the cold?" The tailor lifted his gaze sharp, unwavering. "Feel the cold?" he repeated, each word cutting through the air. "A man who lives in palaces beside roaring fires, who dines over flame and drinks warmed wine he has never truly shivered in the wind. He fears losing power, not the cold. My coats cannot help a man like that." The merchant laughed under his breath. "You sound like a saint. But those who die of cold still die, be they kings or beggars. Does your warmth choose who deserves it?" The tailor was silent for a moment, then set down his needle and stood. "Yes," he said softly, "it chooses the heart that knows how to tremble." He walked to the door and opened it. The wind rushed in, carrying a curtain of white snow. The air cut like blades, but he stood firm, his eyes calm. "Warmth is not for those who merely fear the cold," he said, his voice merging with the wind, "but for those who know what cold truly is." The merchant clenched his fists in frustration but couldn't answer. He didn't understand or refused, to that real warmth could never be bought with gold. The apprentice watched, feeling both pride and fear rising in her chest. His words were not just a refusal, they were a boundary, a line drawn between humanity and the price of greed. Snow clung to his shoulders, to his silver hair. In the faint light, he looked like a part of winter itself, strong, still, unyielding, yet holding something deep no one could break. The merchant opened his mouth, then said nothing. He looked around and saw the villagers standing at a distance, watching silently. No one smiled. No one spoke. They simply stood there, as if their silence itself was a shield around the old man. At last, the merchant bowed his head and said coldly, "One day, you'll have to sell." The tailor replied, "If that day comes, winter will die." The merchant left, his long footprints stretching across the snow, slowly erased by the wind. The apprentice gently closed the door. The lamp inside flickered, then steadied once more. "Aren't you afraid they'll come back?" she asked. He shook his head. "They don't understand the wind. And the wind obeys no rich man." He returned to his table, picked up the silver thread, and continued sewing. "Do you know," he said softly, "every coat I make carries a breath within it. If I sell it to someone who doesn't need it, that breath will die. And when the warmth in the coat dies, the cold will grow twice as strong. It will consume both the wearer and the maker." She nodded, beginning to understand. From that day on, he no longer accepted visitors. People still came knocking, but he only opened the door when he heard a voice that truly trembled not from fear, but from cold that reached the bone. As for those who came with silver tongues and heavy purses, he spoke only one sentence: "My coats do not listen to the sound of gold." Then he closed the door. That line became a story in the village, carried far on the wind, and strangely no one despised him for it. Even the poorest among them, those wrapped in rags, believed he was keeping a part of their warmth safe, sewing not just for their bodies, but for their souls. That night, as the apprentice tidied the loom, she heard him speak softly to himself. "As long as humans still choose whom to keep warm, this winter won't be the last." His voice was quiet, but something in it made her eyes sting. She understood then that he wasn't just teaching her to weave cloth, he was teaching her how to keep her heart from freezing. Outside, the snow still fell, the wind still roared, and the world still traded warmth for coins that could never feel. But he, the old tailor of the frozen land, sat there, sewing in silence, stitching one breath to another, as if by his hands alone the world still had a place to hide from the cold. That night, the wind sounded different. It was no longer the familiar whispering around the roof, but a low, muffled voice, like someone calling a name through a distant storm. The apprentice woke up. The lamp was still burning, its golden light painting trembling shadows across the walls. At first, she thought she was dreaming because outside, the snow was falling gently, yet each flake drifted against the wind, as if someone was blowing them outward from within the house. She sat up, pulled on her coat, and called softly, "Master?" No answer, only a silence so deep it felt alive. She stepped out of her room. The wooden floor was cold as ice. As she passed the sewing table, she stopped. The silver needle lay still. The loom was empty. Only the unfinished coat remained. The silver fabric shimmered under the lamplight, its edge half sewn as if he had just left moments ago. But what made her blood freeze was the final thread still caught in the needle, stretched tight in mid-air. It was trembling as if breathing. The door stood wide open. Wind rushed in, scattering everything, yet the thread didn't break. She walked closer and touched the coat. It was warm, unnaturally warm, warmer than any fire, as if someone's hand had just rested there. On the table, a faint handprint was pressed into the thin layer of dust. A thin, sinewy hand, the hand of the tailor. She called again, louder this time. "Master!" The wind answered with a long, distant howl, whether from the mountain or the forest. She couldn't tell. She ran outside. The snow lashed her face like needles. There were no footprints, no trace that anyone had walked away. Everything was white, endless, empty. Only a faint trail of light stretched from the doorstep, not firelight, but silver, like a single glowing thread unfurling through the night, weaving its way into the storm. She stood in the wind, heart pounding, and called again, but only the wind replied. Then she heard it faint, but unmistakable, the sound of a needle-piercing fabric somewhere out there in the dark. Once, twice, steady, soft, fading. She ran toward it, feet sinking into snow, but with every step the sound grew fainter, slipping farther away. She stopped, gasping, and realized the snow around her was moving, not from wind but from countless silver threads rising from the ground, twisting gently in the air, weaving themselves into a pale spiral. In its center she saw something, a shape, thin, human, a figure holding a needle, sewing into nothingness. The light around him pulsed like breath, then dissolved into the wind. She screamed, "Master!" But the storm swallowed her voice whole. When she awoke, it was morning. The storm had passed, and the sky was so clear she could see the stars still fading above the snow. She was lying on the porch, half buried in white, and in her hand was a single silver thread, the last one left from the loom. She looked around. No footprints, no sign. Nothing but the pure, silent cold of dawn. The house still stood, unchanged except the lamp inside was out. She stepped in, shivering, and went to the table. The unfinished coat was there. Only now, it was complete. Every stitch was perfect, seamless, flowing impossible to tell where one ended and another began. Only one thing was different. Inside the collar, embroidered in fine silver thread, were the words, soft as the wind, keep the warmth when I am gone. She touched the words. The fabric warmed instantly, as if a hand had pressed against her heart. She sat down and wept, not loudly, but quietly, letting her tears melt into the snow in her palms. She understood, then. He hadn't vanished. He had simply followed the path he'd been weaving all his life. The path of the wind, of breath, of promises never broken. She sat there through the morning, staring at the empty loom. And every time the wind slipped through the door, the silver thread on the table trembled, making a faint sound like a needle brushing fabric. She began to understand the wind hadn't taken him. The wind had taken him home. And now, every winter, she still hears that sound in the storm. Not thunder, not wolves, but the steady, patient, gentle rhythm of a needle sewing through snow. People say that when someone is on the verge of freezing to death, that's the sound they hear first. And if they still have enough faith to open their hands, they'll find, in the snow, a single silver thread, warm, soft, glowing like breath. She kept her own thread close to her heart, and kept weaving, but never in the old way again, because she knew he hadn't disappeared. He had become the threads themselves, the breath in the wind, keeping warm those who still trembled through this endless winter. The rumours began spreading just one day after he disappeared. The first to speak of it was a hunter, a man who had left the village early to check his traps along the northern ridge. When he returned, his face was pale, his eyes wide, as if he had seen a ghost. He didn't enter any house. He just stood in the middle of the village, his voice trembling like someone who hadn't yet escaped the cold. "I saw him," he said. "I saw the wind weaver." The entire village went silent. The elders put down their teacups, the children stopped playing, and even the snow outside seemed to pause for a heartbeat. "Where?" someone asked. The hunter swallowed hard, looked around, and answered, "On the white slope, the place no one dares to go. I saw him walking toward it, through the blizzard. No coat, no shoes. Only his silver needle and a bundle of cloth on his shoulder. The wind was against him, but he didn't stop." People exchanged uneasy glances. They knew the place he spoke of, the edge of the frozen forest, where the wind is born, where everything gets torn apart in an instant. What was he doing there? An old woman asked, her voice as faint as dying fire. The hunter shook his head. "I don't know, but I saw something." He hesitated, as if searching for words. The snow around him wasn't falling, it was spinning. Spinning around him, like someone was holding a thread and weaving it. The listeners shuddered. One old woman made the sign of the cross and whispered, "He's sewing for the wind." That sentence spread fast as fire catching on an oil lamp, and by evening the whole village knew. Everyone had their own version. Some said he had gone to mend the sky. Others claimed he was stitching back the boundary between man and winter. A few believed he was finishing his final masterpiece, a coat large enough to cover the world. But the more practical ones just shook their heads. "He's gone mad. Who walks into a storm without fire?" The apprentice didn't believe that. When she heard the news, she stayed silent, eyes fixed on the north, where the mountain disappeared into mist. She knew he wasn't mad, he had never done anything without purpose. If he left, there was a reason. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat before the empty loom, listening to the wind outside, which now sounded like someone pulling thread. At first, she thought it was her imagination, but the longer she listened, the more she recognized the rhythm. Slow, steady, like his breathing. She stood up, opened the door, and looked out. The snow was faint. The wind howled. But through the storm she saw something at the horizon, a faint silver streak, like a thread being drawn across the sky, twisting, weaving from the forest all the way to the clouds. She whispered, "Master," and realized she was trembling not from cold, but because she knew he was still working. But who was he sewing for? Or what? The next morning, a group of villagers decided to search for him. They brought ropes, torches, and dogs. She wanted to go too, but they held her back. "You can't," the elders said. "That forest isn't for the living." She stood there, watching them disappear into the white. The sky grew greyer. By nightfall, none returned. She waited until morning and saw only one man stumble back. His face was blue, his hair frozen stiff, his words barely coherent. When they carried him inside, he kept repeating a single phrase, voice cracking. "I saw him weaving." But there was no loom. People crowded around. "No loom? What do you mean?" He shivered, lifted a trembling hand, and pointed upward. He was weaving with the wind. His needle was glowing. Every time he stitched, the storm broke apart a little. Then the snow stopped and started again, like he was sewing the entire winter. The villagers shuddered. Some were terrified, some wept, some knelt and prayed. The apprentice said nothing. Half of her believed, half didn't. But that night, when the wind outside softened, she knew it wasn't a lie. He was truly sewing for the wind. And maybe he was using his own breath to mend something humanity had torn the balance of winter, or warmth itself. In the days that followed, the snow kept falling, but it no longer bit like before. Villagers said that on some nights they saw silver light in the sky, like threads connecting the stars. Some swore they could hear the faint sound of a needle brushing fabric, carried on the wind. He's still working, she thought, and in that silence she understood maybe he hadn't left them at all. Maybe he had simply gone where his breath belonged. The wind must be woven to exist, and the one who understood it best had gone to do just that. One night, she stood at the door. The snow touched her skin, but it didn't sting. She whispered, "If you're sewing for the wind, then I'll sew for the people. When they wear my coats, they'll hear you breathing." The wind passed through, gently brushing the thread on the loom, making it hum a quiet reply. And from that day on, whenever storms came, people still saw the silver light beyond the forest, that glow no one could ever touch. But everyone knew what it meant. It was the mark of him, the wind weaver, the one who went to sew for winter itself, so it would no longer devour mankind, but hold them softly, in silence, like a promise kept beneath the falling snow. After the rumours about him, the village sank into silence for many days. No one dared to go near the house of the wind weaver anymore, as if something inside was still alive, breathing, watching from behind the misted window. Only his apprentice, the one he had taught to hear the wind, to touch the snow, to understand the cold as a language refused to leave. She stayed in that house, the place that had once echoed with the sound of needle against fabric for so many years, where the oil lamp still burned even when no one refilled it. She told herself she couldn't let that flame die, because if it did, everything he had ever woven might vanish into the wind. The next morning, she opened the door, swept away the snow, relit the lamp, wiped the loom, and sat at the table. On it still lay the unfinished coat, the last piece he had left behind. It was woven from silver fur, fine as smoke, so light her hands trembled when she touched it, afraid that even breathing too hard might make it disappear. The unfinished stitches curved like a sentence left unwritten, stopping where the final silver thread had snapped. She sat for a long time, staring. Every stitch was a word he had left, meticulous, quiet, perfect. So perfect it made her afraid to touch it. She knew she had to finish it. Not to honour him, but because it was the only thing that still tied her to him, to this winter, to the words he once said. "When I am gone, you must keep weaving. Not for me, but for your own breath." She opened the box of silver thread. It was empty. Not a strand left. She searched everywhere, in cupboards, under the table, behind the wooden frame, even in the hidden places where he used to keep his old spools. There were only ordinary threads left, white, grey, black. No trace of that silver light. She slumped to the floor, clutching the coat, tears falling onto the fabric, soaking into every fibre. "Master," she whispered, her voice breaking. I can't weave without the silver thread. I can't hear the wind without you to teach me. But the wind outside kept blowing cold, distant, silent. She felt small, lost in the very place that had once been the home of warmth. The days that followed, she tried to continue. She used white thread, but every needle broke. She tried black, but the coat turned into the dull colour of ashes. She added red, thinking maybe the colour of blood would bring warmth, but the fabric hardened, coarse and lifeless. She threw the needle down in despair. Perhaps, she thought, the silver thread had gone with him. But one night, when the wind rose, she woke to a faint sound in the room. Not loud, not clear, but like a breath passing by her ear. She opened her eyes. The lamp flickered, and in its dim light she saw the loom trembling slightly. On it, the last thread, the one she thought was gone, was glowing faintly, like moonlight melting into water. It wasn't long, just enough for a few stitches. Her heart pounded as she stepped closer. No one from the village could have come in. No one could make that light. She reached out but didn't touch, because the thread was moving on its own. Slowly, gently, it passed through the needle, as if an invisible hand was weaving again. She stood still, afraid to breathe, watching each shining line appear on the coat. When the final stitch was done, the light vanished. Only silence remained. She touched the fabric and understood. It was warm, not the warmth of fire, but of breath, like the warmth of his hand on her shoulder. Long ago, she cried, the silver thread was gone because it had never been real. It was his breath, the promise he had woven into the wind, and now he had sent its last piece to her. The next morning, she carried the coat outside. The wind was gentle, the snow floated softly. She laid it on the stone table before the house, letting the light reflect off it, until the snow around it shimmered silver. "Master," she whispered, "it's finished." She felt the wind pause for a heartbeat. Then a warm breeze brushed her cheek, soft, like a smile. From that day on, she took over the workshop. People came to her, as they once came to him. She didn't accept everyone, only those who truly needed warmth, and she kept sewing, even without silver thread. Yet strangely, her coats were still warm, not with his breath, but with her own. Whenever the wind passed through the doorway, she heard the faint sound of a needle's hum, as if the old weaver was still there, guiding her stitches in silence. Some said they saw silver light glowing through the window each night, as if he still sat beside her, weaving coats for the winter. And she, the apprentice of long ago, had become the heir of the wind, the one who continued to weave the unfinished breaths, so that his thread would never break, and winter would no longer mean death, but a refuge for those who still believed warmth could be sewn with hands, with heart, and with memory. That winter storm came suddenly, like the sky itself had grown tired of being gentle. There was no warning in the morning, the wind was calm, but by noon the whole sky cracked open like shattered glass. Layers upon layers of snow fell, so thick that no one could see the ground anymore, only the endless howling of the wind, long and mournful, like hundreds of souls crying out. She sat inside the workshop, holding the last coat finished, but never worn. Its silver light dimmed under the dying lamp. She knew something was calling her from outside, not a voice, not quite the wind either, but a faint sound, like a needle tapping fabric, again and again inside the storm. She recognized it instantly, his rhythm, slow, steady, precise enough to chill the heart. She stood, put the coat on. It wrapped around her gently, almost weightless, but as she tied the cord, a warmth spread from her chest so deep it brought tears to her eyes. Not from fear, but from the feeling that his hand was resting on her shoulder again. "If you're out there," she whispered, "then I can't stay here." She opened the door. The wind slammed into her like a living wall, forcing her back. Snow slashed her skin like blades, but the coat held. No cold could touch her. She stepped out, each foot sinking deep into snow, leaving footprints that vanished almost instantly behind her. The sky was a solid darkness, no direction, no horizon, only a boundless white. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to follow the sound, the pull of thread, the hum of the needle. Every time the wind shifted, the sound moved too, as if guiding her. At first, she was afraid, but slowly, The fear melted into her breath. She remembered his words. To hear the wind, don't fight it. Let it pass through you. She loosened her shoulders, breathed in, let the wind slide under her collar. And somehow, it no longer cut. It softened, gentle, almost lifting her. Beneath her feet, the snow began to glow, faintly tiny lights, shimmering like strands of silver hidden in each flake. With every step, they brightened, connecting into a thin path that led toward the forest. She knew that was the path he once took. Inside the storm, she heard a whisper, not words, but breathing. The wind brushed her hair, leaving behind a strange warmth, a voice barely audible beside her ear. You've learned to listen, it seemed to say. Now, learn to stitch with your own breath. She stopped, looking around. No one was there, but in the white expanse, great sheets of air were swirling, not real fabric, but ribbons of wind weaving together into a vast, shifting cloak. She realized she was standing inside a storm not made of snow, but of breath, each current of wind, a thread, each flake of snow, a needle. And at the far center, she saw a figure, thin, blurred, still sewing. "Master!" she cried, but the storm swallowed her voice. She ran toward him, pushing through the storm, like through endless waving cloth. The closer she came, the clearer the figure became. He stood in the middle of the blizzard, holding the silver needle, stitching the wind itself, each motion binding the currents together, forming a great spiral. Every time the needle passed, the wind quieted, the snow softened, and light spread outward in silver waves. She wanted to reach him, but each step felt like walking on air, no ground beneath her. "Master!" she shouted again. This time, he stopped. The wind froze. The world stood still. He turned. Though his face was blurred in the glowing light, she recognized those eyes, kind, deep, and sad, like every winter before. He said nothing, only lifted a hand, grasping the air. Between them, a silver thread appeared, stretching from his wrist to hers, so thin it might disappear, yet shining softly. She felt warmth flow through it, faint, trembling, but real. "Master," she choked out. He smiled, lips unmoving, yet his voice echoed in her mind. "You've learned to weave your own breath. Now you must keep it alive. The wind can't be stitched forever. It must remain free." She shook her head, tears freezing on her cheeks. "I don't want you to go." He stepped closer, laid a hand on her shoulder, and she felt such warmth that she couldn't cry anymore. "I'm not leaving," he said. "I'm going back to where I belong." He lifted his head, eyes reflecting the falling snow. "I once wove coats for people. Now I weave for the wind so winter won't kill anymore." Then his hand fell away, and the silver thread dissolved into the air. A gust swept through, carrying him off not violently, but gently, like someone stepping through a doorway into a larger room. She stood there, in the storm, her coat glowing faintly. The wind circled her, but it didn't bite. Instead, she heard the sound of sewing in every gust, steady, rhythmic like a heartbeat. She placed her hand over her chest, feeling her breath merge with the sound. The wind had taken him, but it had also taken part of her. And in that moment, she understood. No one truly disappears, as long as someone remembers how to weave their breath. When the storm finally cleared, they found her sitting in the snowfield, eyes closed, smiling. The silver coat still glowed faintly on her, and around her, the snow had melted into countless thin silver threads, drifting into the sky, as if winter itself was continuing the story. They began, two souls who had learned to listen to the breath of the wind, and to stitch warmth back into the world. In the heart of the storm, she thought she had stepped into another world. There was no ground, no sky, only light swirling in the void, as if the universe itself was being rewoven. Every snowflake that fell glowed, and when they touched, a faint sound rang out, soft as a needle brushing fabric. She walked through that space, her feet no longer feeling snow, but something softer, warmer, the breath of the wind. She looked up, and her heart clenched. Above her, among the flowing ribbons of light, was a familiar figure, slender, his long coat fluttering with the current, holding a silver needle so large it reflected the whole sky. Each time he moved the needle, a streak of blue light burst forth, spreading wide before blending with red, violet, and gold. The heavens moved to his rhythm, like a vast cloth being stitched from pure light. She knew what it was, the aurora, but now it was no longer a natural wonder. It was the fabric he was sewing for the world. He stood among the upper winds, walking on air, no longer burdened by a human form, lighter, purer, like the breath of the storm itself. She called his name, but her voice vanished into the light. He didn't turn back, his hands still working, each stitch steady, every motion a heartbeat echoing through space. She understood he could not stop. He was sewing the sky, stitching the fragments of night together to keep it from breaking apart in the cold. Every band of aurora above was one of his silver threads, the same thread he once said was woven from promises. And now he was keeping the last of them, mending the world's warmth. She stood below, her hands trembling, her eyes filled with tears. The sight before her was too beautiful to be real, yet too sorrowful to be a dream. The storm around her fell silent. Only the sound of his needle remained ringing softly through the heavens, like a distant bell. Light poured down, touching her, setting her silver coat ablaze like fire. She looked up, feeling as if she stood beneath the very cloth he was weaving, the glow brushing her skin, her hair, warmth spreading through her body. "Master," she whispered, "you really are sewing for the wind." And as if he heard her, he stopped. His hand froze mid-air. The silver needle flared, light expanding outward in a great circle around him. He turned, and this time she saw his face clearly. Gentle as ever, but translucent, made of mist and light. He didn't speak, only looked at her with eyes full of sorrow and pride. A single silver thread detached from the fabric above, falling like a strand of the sky's own hair, landing in her hand. She grasped it, and at once his voice filled her mind. "You've made it here. Look closely, this is what I wanted you to see." She looked up. The sky stretched endlessly, its fabric of light spanning from horizon to horizon. The aurora shifted, twisting into a vast arc. But as she watched, she realized it wasn't just light. It was countless shapes, faces, faint but smiling, hands reaching out, breaths merging as one. He was weaving their souls into the sky so that no one would ever be forgotten in the cold. Each stitch of his needle was a memory, a promise, a lost warmth being sewn back together. "Master," she whispered, her voice breaking, "you've sewn a coat for the whole world." He nodded gently, still silent. The silver needle in his hand shimmered once more, then pierced through the final band of light. A long, resonant tone echoed through the air, and then silence. The fabric was complete. The aurora spread across the heavens, so bright that even the snow stopped falling. She looked up, the light washing over her face, her coat, until it slowly faded. He lowered his hand, and the needle vanished. The wind began to blow again, soft, warm. He looked at her one last time. He didn't need to speak, she understood. It was a farewell. "Will you stay up there?" she asked, her voice trembling. He smiled, then slowly dissolved into the light, merging with the very cloth he had woven. The aurora shifted, shimmering like breath, and she knew he was still there, within every thread across the sky. She knelt in the snow, tears falling, but they weren't cold. Everything around her was silent, beautiful beyond words. The heavens still moved, still wove as if they had never stopped. When she rose, the silver thread in her hand began to fade, turning into mist, then sinking into her chest. She placed a hand over her heart, and felt her pulse align with the sound of a needle sewing in the wind. From that night on, whenever darkness fell, she would look up at the glowing sky and know he was still weaving, somewhere the wind never ceases. People in the village said that since that winter, no storm had taken another life. The aurora returned every night, and those who looked closely could see a figure sewing among the stars, a silver needle stitching light between the clouds and the earth. They called it the coat of winter, but she, standing below, eyes lifted, only smiled and whispered, "No, that's my master's coat." Amid the shifting aurora, when the colours above draped across the sky like vast ribbons of cloth, she heard his voice not from lips, but from the wind itself, curling around her. The sound wasn't human speech. It was the voice of breath and light, of snow colliding, blending into a tone deep, distant, and tender like a memory. "You think I weave coats for people?" His voice echoed inside her mind, leaving her frozen in place. He stood in the heavens, his figure fading, yet radiating a strange calm. She wanted to answer but couldn't speak. His voice carried on, like a current passing through the world. "No, my child. I don't weave for people. I weave for winter." She stood still, not yet understanding. He raised his hand, the silver needle flashing, tracing a circle in the air. With every stitch, the light above shifted. The aurora rippled like waves, reflecting her face in its glow. "Do you know why the wind kills?" he asked, his voice free of anger, heavy only with sorrow deep as a chasm. "Because it's lonely. Because no one listens to it breathe. Winter is the same. It isn't cruel. It's just so cold that it bites itself." He turned to her, and in his eyes was no longer the light of a man, but the reflection of the sky itself. "I weave for it, not so I can live, but so it can hurt less. If winter has a coat, it won't kill what it touches." She stood, trembling, her heart pounding. In that instant, everything she had ever understood about him, about their craft, about every story, was turned inside out. The coats he made weren't only for people, they were patches, stitched onto the storm itself. He had sewn the last breaths of those who died in the snow into the fabric of winter, so when the wind blew, it no longer screamed, but sang with the voices of souls at peace. She remembered it all the nights he opened the door to let the wind in, the hours he spoke softly to no one, the moments when snow stopped falling each time he finished a coat. What once seemed like mystery was only compassion endless, aching compassion for what everyone else feared. "Master," she whispered, her voice breaking, "then who do you live for?" He looked at her for a long time. "I don't live for anyone," he said. "I live for a promise. A promise to the wind that I would weave it a breath, so it wouldn't have to cry in loneliness. And now, that promise is almost kept." She clenched her fists, tears falling hot onto the snow, turning into thin wisps of steam. "And me?" she asked. "Who will I weave for?" He smiled soft, like the last snow of the season. "You'll weave for people, because you know what it means to be cold. But remember this, when you weave for people, don't forget to weave for the wind. Because when you think only of humans, you'll forget that winter also has a heart." His words flowed into the light, wrapping around her like warmth and ache at once. He lifted his hand and released the silver needle. It floated in the air, then shattered into 1,000 bright fragments that scattered into the aurora. "From now on," he said, "the wind won't kill anymore. It will sing. And when you hear it sing, remember that's me still weaving." She watched as his form dissolved, strands of his hair blending into green, then violet, then vanishing. But just before he disappeared completely, she heard his final words, a whisper as gentle as breath. Winter was never the enemy. It only needed someone to touch it with warm hands. She knelt, pressing her palm into the snow, and realized it wasn't cold anymore. It was soft, smooth, and faintly warm, as if each flake carried a heartbeat. Above her, the sky burned with light, the aurora stretching endlessly, and she could feel each strand of color stitching together the border between life and death, between humanity and nature, between breath and silence. She rose, tilting her head toward the sky. Reflected in her eyes was the vision of herself standing beneath winter's great coat, the one he had woven, not for anyone to wear, but to cover everything. And she knew winter would never be the same again. The wind still blew, the snow still fell, but beneath it all pulsed a heartbeat, the heart of the old tailor who had stitched the world back together with infinite kindness. She returned to the village in silence, carrying the memory of that light in her chest. And from then on, every winter, people said the northern wind no longer screamed, it sang, softly, like a lullaby. And if one stood still long enough at night, they could hear his voice within it, faint but clear. "I weave for winter, so it won't be so cold that it kills everything." The light of the aurora slowly faded, leaving only soft ribbons of color swirling in the sky, like a vast cloth that had just been sewn. He stood at its center, thin, small, but filled with a peace that no longer belonged to this world. She wanted to move forward, but her feet felt heavy, held down by the snow. The wind around her was eerily calm, no longer howling, but whispering, as if holding its breath for this moment. He turned to her, his eyes gleaming with the silver of the sky. There was no distance between them now, only silence, a silence that had weight, a shape, as though a single word could shatter it into light. "Master," she called, her voice trembling. "Please don't go." He smiled faintly, gentle and tired, like someone who had just finished weaving a lifetime. "I'm not leaving," he said, his voice like breath itself. "I'm only returning." The wind stirred, lifting his cloak. He raised his hand, in his palm lay the silver needle. Its glow wasn't blinding but warm, like firelight in the middle of a frozen night. The same light she had seen flicker across his face countless evenings. "You've learned to weave with your breath," he said softly. "Now, you must learn to let go." She shook her head, tears falling onto the snow, melting instantly. "I can't," she whispered. "If you go, who will weave for the wind?" He looked at her for a long moment, then lifted the needle. From its tip flowed a silver thread, thin, endless, winding through the air, circling them both. The light wrapped around her like invisible arms, gentle yet tightening around her heart. "From now on, you will be the weaver," he said. "But don't weave for me. Weave for the winter you stand in." The wind began to rise. It swirled around him, tugging at his cloak. His hair streamed into the air, unraveling strand by strand into silver threads that drifted upward. She ran toward him, but her hands met only cold, no body, no skin, only snow. He was dissolving, layer by layer, as if he had always been part of the winter itself. She cried out, reaching toward him, voice breaking. "Master, please don't." He paused for a heartbeat, then extended his hand, now transparent, nothing but a line of light. He touched her wrist, and warmth spread through her veins. When she looked down, the final silver thread was wrapped around her wrist, glowing softly in rhythm with her heartbeat. "This thread is the last of me," he said. "When you sew, it won't guide you, it will keep time. And when you hear it tremble, that's me, smiling." She clutched the thread, shaking. Its light shimmered across her face, mixing with her tears, turning them into fragments of melted snow. "Master," she began, but before she could finish, the wind rose fierce and gentle all at once. He broke apart completely then, not into a man, but into hundreds of glimmering fragments that drifted upward, merging with the aurora. The light spread across the sky, so bright that even the snow beneath her glowed. For a moment she felt as if she stood inside an ocean of light, where everything breathed. And through the wind, she heard his voice faint, everywhere at once. "Don't cry, for I am still here, in your breath, in every stitch you make, in every wind you hear." Then silence. Only snow falling, softly, peacefully, like sleep. She knelt, gazing at her hand. The silver thread was still there, coiled around her wrist, reflecting the pale shimmer of the aurora. She lifted her hand, gripping it tightly, feeling the last trace of warmth still alive. She was alone, and yet not. Inside her chest, her heartbeat fell in rhythm with the wind outside. 1 beat, 2, 3, like the steady tap of a needle through cloth. Above her, the aurora kept weaving. If one looked closely enough, they could see a faint figure walking through the light, slow and steady, holding a shining needle, not a body, but a soul, still stitching beams of light into the sky. And she, standing below, looked up and smiled. "I'll continue, Master," she whispered. "But this time, I'll weave for both winter and humankind." The wind brushed past, trembling the thread on her wrist, ringing faintly in reply. From then on, the villagers said that whenever the aurora appeared, there was always one thin silver strand among its colours, slower, softer, the thread of the girl, stretching from the earth to the heavens, from the hands of the living, to the soul of the one who had finished weaving winter. And the wind in that frozen land never screamed again, it only sang, as if lulling someone to sleep in the arms of snow, beneath the light of those who had returned with the wind. When the storm passed, she returned to the village, her legs weak, but her heart still echoing with the sound of the wind. The snow beneath her feet felt softer now, no longer sharp like blades, but covered in a gentle breath. The The sky was no longer pitch black, only a thin veil of white mist, and the faint green glow of the aurora still lingered above, reflecting off rooftops and window panes. The villagers saw her coming back and froze in silence. They said something in her had changed her eyes, no longer feared the cold, and her breath shimmered silver in the air, as if the forest wind itself lived inside her chest. She said nothing, only smiled softly, like someone just awakened from a dream too long. She walked straight to the wooden house that once was his workshop. The door was still ajar, the loom still standing, silent, as if waiting. Inside, the air still carried the scent of wool, lamp oil, and old smoke. She placed her hand on the loom, the dusting of snow falling from it like shining ash. Her hand trembled not from cold, but from familiarity. Every grain of the wood seemed to hum with his voice, every crevice breathed. She inhaled deeply, then opened the box of threads. Pulling out the single silver strand still left the one wrapped around her wrist since the day they parted. Its light was soft now, no longer bright and fierce, but tender like the breath of someone half alive, half fading. She tied it to the needle, sat down, and began to sew. No need to think, no need to see her hands moved on their own, guided by her heartbeat. Each stitch was a memory. Him by the firelight, her listening to snow, him teaching her to hear the wind, her trembling when she first touched the thread, his leaving, the wind turning into words. The stitches intertwined, the strands of light spread across the cloth, and slowly a coat appeared, not quite for humankind, not quite for the divine. It was something in between, where the breath of the living met the soul of winter. The coat had no single colour, at times white like new snow, at times green like the aurora, at times grey like cooled ash. But whatever it became, it always glowed softly, like the oil lamp he once sewed beneath in the night. She worked for days without eating, without sleeping, only listening to the needle strike the fabric and the wind outside the window. Villagers peeked through the cracks of the door, seeing silver lights spilling from within, and fell silent. None dared to call her. They knew she was finishing something final. On the 7th night, under the full moon, she made the last stitch. The silver thread faded, not cut, not gone, but merging with the cloth. She stared, eyes dry, hands resting on the fabric. The coat was complete. She lifted it light as breath, warm as touch. She didn't wear it. Instead, she laid it on the old chair where he once sat, facing the fire. The wood still held the curve of his hands, the bend of his back. She touched it gently, then stepped back. In that instant, the room filled with light. Not harsh, but soft silver, spreading from the coat, touching the walls, the table, the loom, bringing everything quietly back to life. The light did not burn, did not fade. It simply breathed, steady and calm. She sat down before it, and for the first time in her life, she no longer heard the wind howl outside. Instead, she heard a faint sound, the tap of a needle. No one touched the coat, yet it trembled slightly, as if someone unseen was still sewing. She smiled, tears slipping down her cheeks and vanishing before they touched the floor. "Master," she whispered, "I've kept my promise." From that night on, the silver glow in the workshop never went out. Villagers said that even passing by at midnight, they could still see the window lit not bright, not far-reaching, but flickering like the breath of fire. Some claimed they heard the sound of a needle slow, even soft as a heartbeat in sleep. No one dared to enter, no one dared to touch the coat. They were afraid or maybe reverent. For when standing before that light, no one felt cold. They only felt their hearts quiet, as if wrapped in an invisible blanket. She still lived in the village, but spoke little, rarely left the house. Each day she swept snow from the doorstep, boiled water, then sat inside, watching the silver glow slowly spread through the fabric. She didn't light the fire anymore, the room was always warm. One day, a child asked, "Miss, why don't you wear that coat?" She looked at him and smiled softly. "Because it's not meant for anyone to wear. It's the coat of winter." The child didn't understand, only nodded and ran off, leaving tiny footprints in the snow. When the door closed, she turned back to the coat. Its light shimmered in her eyes, and for a fleeting moment she saw his figure sitting in the chair across from her, smiling just as he always had. She wasn't afraid. She simply nodded, still the same apprentice, still learning. And so, night after night, the coat continued to glow. The silver light slipped through the cracks of the door, touching the snow outside, making it melt slower, softer. People called it the fire that doesn't burn, the last miracle of the weaver of the wind. But to her, it wasn't a miracle. It was breath. His breath, woven into every thread, every stitch, and into her heart, the last person who still remembered that even winter needs to be kept warm. And then, night falls again like every other night in the land where snow never melts. But there, in the small village resting against the mountainside, a silver light still burns, soft as breath, glowing from the window of an old workshop. They say that whenever the wind rises, the sound of a needle can be heard within steady, patient, like a heartbeat sewing through the dark. Some believe it is the soul of the old tailor, still there, continuing a work that never ended. Others say it is his apprentice, the girl who once wove the final coat with her own breath. And some whisper that the two have become the wind itself, weaving a new coat for winter each year, so that it will not grow too cold and destroy what warmth remains. Whether they believe or not, no one dares to enter that house anymore. They only pass by, bowing their heads, as if greeting a craftsman still working in silence. The children of the village, every winter, play a game. They stand still before the workshop, close their eyes, and try to hear whether the thread slicing through the wind still sings. One once said, "I heard it like someone's weaving the sky." The grown-ups only smile, saying nothing. But in their eyes, something flickers, part fear, part gratitude. Time passes. The years lay more and more snow upon that roof. The girl grows old, her hair turning silver like thread. And one day, she too disappears just like her master once did. When they look inside, all that remains are a chair, a loom, and a coat still shining in the dark. No one knows where she went, only that the wind sang long that night, as if bidding a loved one home. From then on, the story became legend. The people of the frozen lands called it the legend of the weaver of the wind, the tale of two souls who learned to listen to the breath of winter and sow warmth back into the world. They tell it each time the snow returns to children, afraid of the dark, to travelers wandering far, to remind them that no matter how thick the frost, there will always be a light that never fades. And so, here we are tonight, by the fire, as the wind howls beyond the window, telling you that same story, of the tailor who sewed coats for the wind, and the apprentice who learned to hear the needle inside her heart. My voice may tremble, but the tale must go on, for some legends don't need believers, only listeners. Do you hear it? The wind is still out there, but it no longer screams, no longer bites. It sings, as if reminding someone that winter was never the enemy, only a forgotten child needing a warm coat. The fire flickers, lighting your face, you, the one listening now. And I wonder, if you were that tailor, if your hand held the silver needle, if the cloth of the world lay before you, who would you weave for? Would you weave for humankind, so they no longer tremble before the wind? Or would you weave for winter itself, so it no longer kills what it touches? Think carefully, for the answer isn't in your mind, it's in your breath. With every exhale you make into the cold night, a thread drifts out thin as smoke, and you are the one who decides where it will lead. I am only the storyteller, keeping this flame alive. But the legend, it's in your hands now. Maybe tomorrow, when you step outside and look up at the snowy sky, you'll see a faint silver line stretched across the heavens. If you see it, don't speak. Just inhale deeply and let the wind pass through your chest. Because perhaps, at that very moment, the old tailor is weaving a new line and waiting for your answer. Who will you weave for? You who are listening tonight? For humankind or for winter? I ask not for you to answer me, but for the wind to hear. For only the wind knows where the true answer lies. And when it slips through the door, brushing against this flame, I know the story, though ended, is still being woven. If you're still here, it means your heart is beating in rhythm with the stories of the night. Hit subscribe, and join me on the next journey, where every shadow hides a secret waiting to be awakened. And now, dim the lights, let your mind drift, and let sleep carry you away. Sleep peacefully for tonight. The world is still whispering.